The recent lethal strike conducted by the U.S. military on a suspected drug vessel in the Caribbean Sea is the latest incident in a significant and highly controversial escalation of U.S. counter-narcotics operations. The operation, which reportedly killed 3 individuals described by U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth as narco-terrorists, targets vessels allegedly involved in illicit narcotics smuggling and operated by U.S.-designated terrorist organizations. This specific strike is part of a broader, intensified campaign launched since early September 2025, which has resulted in the sinking of over a dozen vessels and the deaths of more than 60 individuals across the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific international waters. The administration asserts that these actions are necessary to protect the American homeland from the poisoning effects of illegal drugs, promising to treat these trafficking groups with the same military resolve previously applied to organizations like Al-Qaeda. This campaign is distinguished by its use of lethal kinetic force far from U.S. shores, marking a departure from traditional law enforcement-led drug interdiction efforts. Analysis and reasons for the militarized approach. The decision to escalate counter-narcotics efforts into a lethal military campaign stems from 2 primary drivers: a stated goal of homeland security and a complex geopolitical strategy. The stated reason relies on a controversial legal interpretation, classifying drug cartels as designated terrorist organizations, DTOs, and asserting that the narcotics flow constitutes an armed attack against the United States. This legal framework invokes Title 10 authority, typically reserved for acts of war and self-defense against unlawful combatants, allowing the military to employ kinetic strikes instead of traditional interdiction and arrest procedures. This approach sidesteps the judicial system, operating under the principle of military necessity in international waters. The underlying strategic reason appears to be twofold. Firstly, it satisfies a political desire to demonstrate maximum commitment to stemming the drug crisis, particularly by linking foreign drug sources to the devastating domestic overdose rates. Secondly, the operations serve as a means of exerting extreme pressure on the Venezuelan regime of Nicolás Maduro, near whose coast many of these strikes have occurred. The deployment of significant naval assets, including an aircraft carrier strike group, far exceeds the requirements of a typical counter-narcotics operation, suggesting a broader objective of regime pressure or military posturing in the region. The strikes thus function as both a counter-drug operation and a projection of force in a highly sensitive geopolitical theater. Consequences and ethical dilemmas. The consequences of this militarized campaign are profound, spanning legal, ethical, and diplomatic domains. Legally and ethically, the strikes have drawn international condemnation. The UN human rights chief and various legal experts have labeled the actions as potential extrajudicial killings. Critics argue that the U.S. has failed to publicly provide sufficient evidence that the targeted individuals posed an imminent threat to the U.S., a requirement for self-defense under international law, or that the vessels were carrying fentanyl, the drug responsible for most U.S. overdose deaths, rather than cocaine. The lack of transparency and due process, including the refusal to release the legal opinions and the list of DTOs, has led to bipartisan demands from U.S. lawmakers for accountability and clear justification. Diplomatically and geopolitically, the operations have severely heightened tensions in the Caribbean basin. Venezuelan President Maduro has accused the U.S. of fabricating a war, and the military buildup, including the reactivation of a Cold War-era base in Puerto Rico, has been viewed by analysts as a significant step toward potential broader military engagement, intentionally or unintentionally. Furthermore, the operational consequence is that while the strikes disrupt maritime routes, they may push sophisticated cartels to adapt quickly, shifting to more difficult-to-track methods like aerial smuggling, the use of unmanned or semi-submersible vessels, and the use of commercial container shipping, thereby complicating future interdiction efforts. Prediction and sustainable solutions. If the current policy remains, the prediction is that the campaign will continue its current trajectory, likely expanding the theater of operations to fully encompass the Eastern Pacific, where a majority of U.S.-bound cocaine is trafficked. The total casualty count will rise, and the legal and political controversies will intensify, potentially leading to legislative attempts to constrain the executive branch's military authorities abroad. The long-term effectiveness of the strikes in fundamentally halting the drug flow is questionable, as long as the underlying drug production and financial networks remain intact. Sustainable solutions require a strategic shift away from purely kinetic military force. Firstly, there must be a return to the rule of law by prioritizing non-lethal interdiction and working through established multilateral cooperation channels, such as the Joint Interagency Task Force South, JIATFS, which emphasizes intelligence and partner nation collaboration. Secondly, efforts must focus on supply-side disruption by targeting the financial infrastructure and the sourcing of precursor chemicals necessary for synthetic drug production, which are often produced outside the immediate Caribbean area. Finally, the most effective solution is to reduce domestic demand in the United States through better public health, addiction treatment, and prevention programs, addressing the root cause of the drug trade's profitability. A balanced approach combining enhanced intelligence-led interdiction with strong diplomacy and domestic public health efforts is required to achieve lasting security.